So this is the third video in the series on the reverse addict, and obviously the first two we set the context of what reverse addiction and codependence is, and following that we looked at the universal patterns that emerge in dysfunction and how the reverse addict is one of those patterns. Now, it was fascinating to me as we begin to look at Luke 15 today and the prodigal son. And most of you, if you've heard a sermon on this, will probably have heard someone say it should have been called the prodigal sons. And of course the older son is the one that we're looking at mostly today, because he's the one that exhibits the reverse addict pattern. But it was fascinating to me when I was asked to do this, that as I explored this scripture, that Jesus was talking about these patterns 2,000 years ago, way before therapists intuitively saw them or used them, and before neuroscience proved them. We were hearing it from Jesus' mouth 2,000 years ago. And again, you know, if you've heard sermons on this, you'll have heard sermons on the Father's love and patience and acceptance and so on. All fantastic stuff. And of course we can never get to the bottom of the word or understand all that it has to teach us. But today I want to talk about what it revealed to me as I read it again and used it in my talk. Because as I say, I think the two patterns are really well described and understood in this story. If we were talking about addiction, reverse or otherwise, we'd be looking at the big themes, and those big themes might be, for instance, isolation, selfishness, in terms of looking at the relationship with dead things or inappropriate relationship, which is my approach. We'd also be looking at dead things and the attraction into that world of bonding with dead things. We'd also be looking at rock bottom as a big theme. Now, all those themes are encapsulated in this story. They're all there. And so we'll take a quick look at them. As usual, I've got my timer running, and so we've only got 10 minutes on this, but I want to give you a brief idea of this, then you can go and study it for yourself. Now, in the first verse, Jesus says, there was a man and he had two sons. Now, that immediately sets the context, and so we know immediately it's going to be a family story. We know it's going to be about relationship, and we know it's going to have three players. And so the father and the two sons, and so that sets the context. And immediately the next verse, he says, the younger son said, divide up the inheritance and give me my share. And now I think this is the theme of isolation. Do you think when you read this that this son was discussing these ideas with anyone? Does this seem like a good idea to you? It seems to me it's a disastrous idea, and that if he would have been discussing it with any of his mentors or friends or advisors in any way, that they would have all said, don't do it. But what we know intuitively as therapists, for years, isolation is bad. You'll hear it in any rehab or anywhere. But neuroscience is showing us it's much worse than we even thought. When we isolate, our thinking, any flaw in our thinking gets magnified every time the idea spins around. There's no fresh air, there's no input. And so I think he'd been isolating and thinking about this for some time. Now, what does he do then? It says not long after this, after father gives him his inheritance, he gathered together all he had, went off to a distant land. Now, distant, I think, is an important word here, because now we're talking about selfishness. And distance is a sense of, I'm only thinking about me. Remember the addict pattern? Everything will work out if only I get everything I want. So off he goes, and Jesus says he squanders his wealth on while living. Now, here's the next big pattern that emerges in addiction, moving into the world of dead things. These are false friends, they're false environment, it's not where he really lives, it's not his real family. He's spending his money like water, and he's doing a very childlike thing. Just give me pleasure, give it me now. Let me have exactly what I want. He's starting to bond with dead things. What happens? Well, the story goes on very quickly. It says there was then a famine in that land, and he began to be in need. And now we're heading for the next big theme, which is the rock bottom. This is the big theme in the addict's life. It says that nobody gave him anything. I love that line, because that is a real description of what it feels like to be at the end of yourself. No resources. He's given away everything he has, and everyone's scarpered and gone. And it says he longed to eat the pods that the pigs were eating, and it says he came to his senses. Now this is a phenomenal description of a rock bottom. To come to your senses is what a rock bottom actually is. It's when you look at your situation from a much more adult perspective than you've been doing and say, what on earth is this? What is going on? It's like you have a wake-up moment, and that's exactly what happens to him. The Wycliffe version actually says he turned again to himself. And when we look at in a future video series on working with the inner child or the inner parts, we'll develop this a lot more. But for now, just to ask this question, who's turning to who here? Which part of me is talking to which part of me? This is very real. These are Jesus' own words. And he basically came to his senses. And he said, I'm going to go home. You know, even my father's servants and so on. We all know what comes next. He goes home, he's received and accepted by his father. The ring's on his finger, the robe's on his back, the fattened calf is killed. And there's nothing but a celebration. Phenomenal. And what does he say? I love this. The father says, for my son was dead and is now alive. Just an amazing description of what it means to recover. To come from the world of dead things into the world of living things. And that is what recovery is all about. Now let's get on to the second son. That is the pattern. And believe me, that's the pattern for reverse addicts too. But we really want to talk more about the older brother, because he's the one, doesn't he look better? That pattern always looks better. The pattern of everything will work out if only everybody else gets what they want. As a reverse addict, you're knocking yourself out, trying to keep everybody happy, trying to see what you can get out of. Your security can come from everyone else getting what they want. And this guy has been religiously, and I'm not choosing that word by accident, he's been religiously following his father's commands. And of course, when the younger son comes back, where is he? He's out in the field working, he's doing his father's duty and so on. Now, doesn't this look very similar, you know, when Jesus says, I only do what I see my father doing? It sounds so spiritual, doesn't it? It sounds like the older brother's doing the same, but he really isn't. This is what we call pseudo-spirituality. It looks good, but the motivation behind it is completely unhealthy. And so this is what he's doing. How do we know? How do we know that's true? Because when the servant comes out and he says, what's going on? What's all the fuss? And he says, your brother's returned. He's put the ring on his finger, the robe on his back. He's killed the fattened calf. We're going to celebrate. What is his reaction? His reaction is not, if it was spiritual, it would be, let's celebrate. Fantastic, my brother's back. Fantastic. He would be happy about that. But in fact, he's not happy at all. What he says is, he's angry. He's very angry. In fact, it's so bad, it's so difficult that Jesus actually never concludes the story. We don't know what happens to the older brother. We don't know whether he does come into the house or whether he stays out. Even his father's imploring him to come inside, and we don't know what happens. Because actually, what's happened is that the younger brother has actually gone through his difficulties. He's been through his pain barrier. He's come out the other side, and he's into recovery now. He's beginning his recovery. He's dealt with his humility and his shame and so on. He's come back into the world of the living. But the older brother hasn't yet. He's still out there. He's still struggling with his difficulties. And so what do we say about this? We say that he's also just as afflicted as the younger brother, but he has a pattern that kind of looks better. He's basically in a position where he's got to decide now whether he wants to recover or not. There's my alarm. So I'm going to wrap this up now. Of course, there is so much more we could say, but essentially I just want you to get the two patterns. And it's phenomenal that in a lot of things, science is now catching up to what Jesus was talking about 2,000 years ago. Of course, he describes the patterns perfectly and how they play out. So in the next video or two in this series, I'm going to be talking about how you can practically do things about your situation. If you are a reverse addict and you've been listening and watching to these videos, then you'll be feeling very uncomfortable now about where you are and what's been happening in your life. And we're going to talk to you about how to help you with, whether you're a partner, whether you're a sibling, whether you're in a family, whether you are, even work colleagues, friends. This will affect everything that you do. So we're going to help you understand it, and we're going to talk about practical things that you can do as part of your own recovery. So I'll see you on the next one.